Are you surprised Ron Paul is polling so well?
I think it's horrible. I think that he is absolutely the most liberal, radical, left-wing person to run for president of the United States in the last 50 years. Nobody else wants to dismantle the military, including Obama, but he does. Even Obama doesn't want to repeal the Patriot Act, but he does. Even Obama doesn't say that we caused 9/11 and brought it on ourselves, but Ron Paul does. Even Obama doesn't want to legalize heroin and cocaine, but Ron Paul does. This guy is no conservative. This guy is a ultra left-wing radical.
And when you have somebody that comes along whose critique of the modern state, which is what American conservatism is, that much of what we've done is outside the bounds of the Constitution, it's wrong, it's too expensive, it does not work. When you have a candidate like Ron Paul who comes along and says, hey, I agree with Barry Goldwater. If the Constitution says we can't do it, we won't do it. We can't afford it. It's the reason we're in this mess. The idea that that's somehow out of sorts or unusual, when it's really the bedrock of the definition of American conservatism, if Barry Goldwater still has any claim on that, or the U.S. Constitution, or the Founding Fathers, is completely absurd. And the people who criticize Congressman Paul and others like him, his son Senator Rand Paul and others, and say, well, you know, maybe you're not conservative enough because you don't represent the conventional Republican brand that's in power right now. Well, that conventional Republican brand is why we have big government in this country. We can expect the Democrats to give us big government, but we need an opposition party to stop it. Have they been very good at that? Absolutely not. And we're seeing with the Tea Party and the grassroots finally a bubbling up of genuine American conservatism again. I think it's wonderful.
You've addressed primarily big government domestic programs, which everyone should recognize has never been representative of authentic conservative beliefs here. But we also have big government warfare statism, which now many of those claiming to be the leaders of conservatism have been promoting for the last several administrations and continue to promote in Republican circles today.
Well, it has become an article of faith that you have to be pro-war to be conservative. Not only is that absurd, let's use the standards I was just using a little while ago. The confusion comes in with the Cold War versus what they're calling the war on terror now. You know, I believe it was William F. Buckley who said that we must endure big government at home to defeat the Soviet menace, and then we would go back to the Constitution and retract. Well, we've defeated the Soviet menace. That happened at the end of the 1980s. Heroes of mine like Pat Buchanan said, hey, job well done. We've accomplished this. Now let's roll back the empire. Let's get out of NATO. Let's start limiting government again. And a lot of people in the Republican Party said, no, well, you know, we got a problem over there in Kosovo, and then 9/11 happened, and people are telling us that people are in caves and have no really, you know, organization, anything like what the Soviet Union represented with nuclear missiles and being in Cuba and all that sort of stuff, that we need to fear this outfit like we feared the Soviet Union and have the same sort of military buildup. I'm sorry. The way we got Osama bin Laden was exactly how Ron Paul suggested after 9/11 with his letter of marque and reprisal proposal. The Congress draws up a bounty or you send a special unit to go after these people, but wars of invasion and occupation for years on end not only don't make sense, but we can't afford them. But we have people in the Republican Party that think that is the definition, personified, of conservatism, to do that. Well, I can tell you, using conservative figures like Russell Kirk and Richard Weaver and Robert Nesbitt, all who were giants at National Review in the 1960s, all had the same foreign policy opinions as Ron Paul. To say that Ron Paul's a leftist is to say, oh, I don't know, Jack Kemp, the 1996 VP nominee who opposed the Iraq War, was a leftist. It's to say that Pat Buchanan was a leftist. It's to say that Robert Novak, who opposed the Iraq War, was a leftist. That is completely absurd. And to the extent that some Republican critics of Ron Paul and others of his mindset, of the sort of non-interventionist mindset, that they call that, you know, somehow leftist, means either they really don't understand the history of their own movement, the conservative movement, or they are really that ignorant. There's no excuse for
it. Do you see progress being made both on the political level and in the public opinion?
Absolutely. During the Bush years, which were some dark, dark times for those of us who believe in limited government and the Constitution, what was negotiable was for the size of government. Under George W. Bush, we doubled the size of government. We doubled the national debt. That was non-negotiable. That was negotiable. You could have bigger government. What was non-negotiable was foreign policy. You had to be in Iraq. If you didn't support that, you weren't a good conservative. Well, the script has flipped. Now with the Tea Party, these grassroots activists who are waking up to the Constitution, foreign policy is negotiable. Tea Partiers are willing to think, hey, we have a $15 trillion national debt, we need to reduce it. Pentagon spending, it's a third of our budget, should be on the table. That's not controversial anymore. And, for those of us who believe in limiting government and having a balanced budget and getting away from this big monstrosity in Washington, D.C., that is a necessity. Entitlements alone won't do it. You have to address entitlements, you have to address our foreign policy, and you can begin to bring us back to that constitutional type of conservatism that we all recognize as the genuine American tradition.
It is quite amazing that in recent years, things like nation building and peacekeeping that were formerly associated with liberal internationalism, with one worldism and whatnot, has now been adopted by so many of the Republicans who, again, claim this is now a conservative position.
Well, that's absolutely right. Look, sovereignty has always been an important issue. America's national sovereignty. You have, as Senator Rand Paul said, when Obama decided to go to war in Libya, he consulted the Arab League, he consulted the UN, he consulted everybody but the United States Congress. Well, I'm sorry, our Constitution says that when you do these sorts of things, Congress declares war, the president figures out how you wage those wars. Well, President Obama took it upon himself just to do everything. And President Bush did similar things. At least he went to Congress in some respect about Iraq, but that was still constitutionally questionable. Obama's taken this a step further. And it's awful funny, the same left that was so upset about George W. Bush with civil liberties, Guantanamo Bay, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, with the Patriot Act, you have a Democratic president doing all of that and not only maintaining it, but expanding it in some cases. And many on the left are still loyal to him. Complete blind partisanship. I see more action on the American right now towards getting back to a constitutional republic, and that includes looking at our foreign policy and domestic policy, than any time I've seen in my lifetime.
Constant Conservative Ron Paul by Jack Hunter. When Ron Paul ran for president in 2008, polls showed that Americans at large were worried about an increasingly bad economy, angry at Washington for bailing out Wall Street, and weary of the Iraq War. GOP primary voters found themselves defending a Republican president who was on the unpopular side of all three issues, supporting a Republican nominee who agreed with him, and having to choose from a Republican field of candidates virtually indistinguishable from their president, their nominee, and each other, except one. With Ron Paul all but declaring his candidacy for president this week, polls show that Americans at large are most worried about a bad economy. Obama's high negatives indicate a persistent distrust and disgust with Washington, and this president's three Middle Eastern wars are arguably more unpopular than Iraq and Afghanistan were 3 years ago. Yet, even though they will have adjusted their various positions accordingly, 2012 GOP primary voters will generally find a field of candidates willing to bash the White House for basically doing the same things these same candidates once defended a Republican president doing. In fact, most potential 2012 candidates will be as guilty of contributing to big government as the president they'll criticize. Mitt Romney gave us the blueprint for government-run health care. Tim Pawlenty and Newt Gingrich gave Republican support for cap and trade. Rick Santorum ran cover for Bush's entire statist agenda by touting the president's alleged social conservatism. Adding ideological insult to injury, most of these candidates still promote an astronomically expensive foreign policy while they simultaneously and contradictorily claim we must cut spending. By and large, these candidates are conservative in rhetoric only, not their records, as has been the case with most Republican presidential candidates for decades. That is, again, except one. During the periods when conservatives find themselves not defending big government Republicans and instead choose to stress the need for limited government and constitutional fidelity, they echo the sentiments of Ron Paul. The difference is Paul never changes his sentiment. When conservatives are not defending big government Republicans and instead choose to talk about the need to eliminate debt and deficits, they are repeating the philosophy of Ron Paul. The difference is Paul never changes his philosophy. Paul's conservative consistency remains true even when, and perhaps especially when, his fellow conservatives disagree with him. When conservatives attack Paul for his non-interventionist foreign policy views, the Texas congressman is quick to remind them that it is mathematically impossible to reduce the debt or deficits without addressing Pentagon spending. Cutting NPR, Planned Parenthood, and earmarks will do nothing to effectively reduce the debt, no matter how much each might excite conservatives emotionally. Likewise, ignoring the need for military spending cuts will continue to help sustain and grow the debt, no matter how emotionally attached some conservatives are in their support for maintaining the status quo. Obsessing over Obama's birth certificate might be fun for some conservatives, but it only distracts from the U.S. economy's impending death certificate, says Paul. Excitement over a reality TV star with a bad comb-over may hold conservatives' attention for the moment. Another moment wasted, says Paul, by not addressing the stark reality that is our collapsing dollar and economy. Many conservatives draw a battle line between Republicans and Democrats. Paul draws his line between those who support limited government and those in both parties who consider it unlimited. Indeed, Ron Paul is the conservative constant in U.S. politics. To the extent that the American right is consistently conservative, it is generally in line with Paul. To the extent that the American right gets distracted from conservative principles, typically in the name of Republican partisanship or some emotional attachment to a particular aspect of statism conservatives generally like, it finds itself at war with Paul. But much of the GOP infighting Paul found himself in the middle of in 2008 has either vanished or significantly subsided. If the Republican leadership seems to have learned very little from the Bush years, the GOP's conservative base has noticed this stubbornness and now sets its sights on defeating big government Republicans every bit as much as Democrats. For the political establishment, the Tea Party movement represents something new and perhaps unsettling in our politics. For Ron Paul and his admirers, it means there is finally a conservative movement. With an overarching concern for limiting government and eliminating the debt, the now widespread conservative condemnations of Keynesian economics and attacks on Ben Bernanke and the Federal Reserve would have been unthinkable in 2008. Today, more Americans than ever seem willing to accept substantive entitlement reform and even oppose raising the debt ceiling, reflecting popular sentiments noticeably more radical than anything that could have been conceivable just a few years ago. Not all conservatives are in agreement with Paul's foreign policy views, but they are significantly more open to them, especially within the context of criticizing a Democratic president's seemingly foolish interventions and the absurdity of borrowing money from China to pay for them. Heading into 2012, Paul's poll numbers equal or exceed those of the perceived major potential candidates. His fundraising abilities equal or exceed those of the same candidates, and the once perennial political outsider has now become a household name. More importantly, when it comes to the issues, most conservatives and perhaps most Americans are finding themselves increasingly in agreement with Paul. Ron Paul is the conservative constant in American politics. In 2012 and beyond, may there be more Americans willing to be as consistently conservative.